A millionaire CEO went for a quiet walk in the park, then heard three little girls singing beside an empty jar. What he learned next changed his life forever. Henry Milton walked slowly through the quiet city park, his polished shoes crunching softly against the gravel path. The summer air was warm but gentle, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and blooming flowers. Tall trees swayed lightly above him, their green leaves whispering to one another in the breeze. Henry's light brown hair stirred slightly as the wind passed, and he squinted against the golden sunlight slipping through the canopy. He wore a crisp button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and tailored slacks that hinted at his usual corporate uniform. But today, he wasn't on a business call, wasn't in a meeting, wasn't answering emails or analyzing markets. Today, he was simply walking. To anyone watching, Henry might have looked like a man with everything: a sharp mind, a powerful position, wealth beyond measure. He was the CEO of one of the fastest-growing investment firms in the country, known for his strategic brilliance and relentless ambition. But in truth, that ambition had taken everything from him: peace, connection, even parts of himself he could no longer name. Lately, even the silence in his penthouse apartment felt heavy. This park, with its worn benches and families strolling by, offered a kind of quiet he couldn't buy. Children laughed in the distance, chasing bubbles and squealing near the fountain. A woman jogged past with her dog, earbuds in, lost in her own world. But Henry noticed none of it. His mind was elsewhere, walking through memories as old and faded as the photographs he never looked at anymore. He thought about choices made, calls ignored, and one summer in particular, 6 years ago, that still haunted him for reasons he never quite understood. He paused near a small garden bed filled with daisies and lavender, taking a deep breath. The scent was unexpectedly soothing. He didn't know why he came here today. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe boredom. Or maybe, deep down, he was searching for something he couldn't name. Whatever the reason, he stayed. And as he stood there, letting the world move around him, something in the distance caught his ear, a sound that would change everything. The sound came softly at first, gentle, almost like a breeze humming between branches, but it wasn't wind. It was a voice. No, more than one. Henry turned his head slightly, narrowing his eyes as he tried to locate the source. The melody drifted across the park like a thread of light through water, delicate and surprisingly in tune. It was a song he hadn't heard in years, some old folk tune he couldn't quite name, yet it pulled at something inside him with quiet insistence. Curious, he followed the sound, letting it guide him along the path, past benches and trees and scattered picnickers. As he turned a corner near the fountain, he saw them, 3 small girls standing side by side on the edge of the stone walkway, singing with such pure harmony that the world seemed to pause around them. They were maybe 6 years old, dressed in simple summer clothes that looked just a bit too big for them. All 3 had soft blonde hair pulled into messy ponytails and wide brown eyes that sparkled with a mix of concentration and joy. In front of them sat a glass jar, empty, except for a few crumpled dollar bills and some coins scattered at the bottom. A hand-drawn sign rested beside it, written in crayon, "Singing for Mom." Henry felt an unexpected tug in his chest. He didn't often let emotion rise to the surface, especially not in public, but something about the scene was disarming. They sang not for attention, not for show, but with sincerity, as if each note meant something more than just melody. People passed by without really stopping. A couple slowed down, smiled politely, and kept walking. A man tossed in some change without looking. But Henry stood still, completely absorbed. He watched their faces, so full of life and effort, and noticed how in sync they were, like they'd been singing together since the day they could speak. Their voices weren't polished or trained, but they were beautiful in a way that perfection never could be. Raw, honest, and deeply human. He moved a little closer, not wanting to interrupt, and sat on the edge of a low planter across from them. He rested his hands on his knees and listened, letting the song wash over him. There was something about the way their voices lifted on the final chorus, how their eyes scanned the park with hope, that made him feel like he was witnessing something sacred. As the song came to an end, their voices faded out gently, like the closing of a music box. The girls exchanged proud glances and giggled quietly, their cheeks flushed from the effort. Henry remained still, unsure why the performance had struck him so deeply, only that it had. Then, as one of the girls leaned down to adjust the jar, their eyes met, and he felt a sudden chill, not from the breeze, but from something else. Something he couldn't explain. They looked familiar. He didn't know yet that this moment would unravel the neatly built structure of his life. He only knew that something had shifted. And it had started with a song. The applause came slowly, just a few scattered claps from a passerby and a soft chuckle from an older woman walking her dog, but Henry remained still, his hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the girls as they collected themselves. They whispered something to each other, then sat cross-legged on the pavement, sharing a half-empty bottle of water. The jar in front of them barely had enough for a cup of coffee, yet none of them looked disappointed. Instead, they seemed proud, as if they'd done something truly meaningful. Henry rose from the planter and walked slowly toward them, careful not to startle them. One of the girls looked up as he approached, her eyes wide but calm. The others followed her gaze, and for a moment all three just stared at him. There was no fear in their faces, only a strange kind of curiosity, like they were trying to decide whether he was worth talking to. He smiled, not his usual corporate grin but something softer, less practiced. "You girls sing beautifully," he said, his voice steady, though something in his chest trembled. "That song, it really moved me." The one in the middle, the boldest of the three, gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said politely, then glanced at the jar. "We're singing to raise money." Henry looked down at the sign, at the uneven crayon letters and the little drawing of a woman with curly hair and a big smile. "For your mom?" he asked gently. "Is she sick?" The girls looked at each other. Then the same bold one, who seemed to speak for the group, shook her head. "No. She just works a lot. She's always tired. We wanted to do something nice. Maybe get her a surprise." Henry crouched down, resting his arms on his thighs so he was eye level with them. "What kind of surprise?" "A necklace," another girl piped up. Her voice was softer, more hesitant. "One with a heart on it. She always looks at it in the shop window but never buys it." Henry nodded slowly. He felt an ache deep in his stomach, one he hadn't felt in years. These weren't children asking for pity or handouts. They were trying, truly trying, to bring joy to someone they loved. And they were doing it the only way they knew how. "Does your mom know you're out here?" he asked carefully. The girls exchanged a look again, and the first one answered, "She's over there." She pointed across the park to a bench near a coffee cart. A woman sat hunched over a laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard, a paper cup of coffee beside her, long hair falling around her face like a curtain. Henry followed the direction of their gesture, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out her features. The woman looked young, late 20s or early 30s, and tired. Not just physically tired, but drained, as if she'd been carrying something heavy for far too long. She looked familiar in a way that made his heart beat faster, though he couldn't quite place why. He turned back to the girls, still crouched before them, and tried to steady his voice. "Do you come here often?" "Only sometimes," said the quiet one. "When Mom has to work and we don't have school. We like singing." The third girl, who hadn't spoken yet, leaned forward a little and added, "Do you want to hear another one?" Henry opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught. His gaze drifted again to the woman on the bench. Something in his gut twisted, a feeling that didn't come from reason or memory, but instinct. He felt as though the ground beneath him was slowly beginning to shift. "Yes," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd love to hear one more." But even as the girls stood and prepared to sing again, Henry couldn't take his eyes off the woman in the distance. He didn't know her name yet. But something inside him already knew that his life, every quiet, controlled piece of it, was about to come undone. Henry didn't know how long he stood there, the echoes of Celia's words ricocheting through him, each one leaving a deeper mark than the last. "They're yours." The words sounded simple, even quiet, but they landed with the weight of a thunderclap. It was as if something buried deep within him had suddenly been unearthed, and now that it was exposed to the light, he couldn't look away from it. His eyes drifted once more toward the girls, who were now sitting in a circle on the grass, giggling over something one of them had whispered. They looked so normal, so free, as if the world had never tried to bend or break them. He couldn't understand how that kind of innocence had survived in spite of everything. Celia slowly sat back down on the bench, brushing away the spilled coffee with the edge of a napkin before pushing her laptop aside. Henry remained standing, hesitant, like a guest who had walked into someone else's home uninvited. He wanted to sit beside her, to ask 1,000 questions, to make sense of the time lost, but he also felt like he didn't have the right. So instead, he stayed on his feet, caught somewhere between apology and awe. "You really didn't know," she said after a long silence, not as a question but as a statement laced with disbelief. "I didn't," he said, his voice low and dry. If I'd known even for a second, I wouldn't have," he trailed off, realizing there were no words that could reshape the past. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "I told you," she said, with a mixture of sadness and restrained frustration. "I left messages. I sent emails. I showed up to your office once, remember? That was back when you still had a receptionist screening your calls like you were royalty. I tried, Henry. But the moment I realized I was pregnant, you were already gone, off to London, then Tokyo, then who knows where. You made your choice. I just had to figure out how to survive mine." Henry winced, not because her words were cruel, but because they were so painfully true. He remembered that year vividly, back-to-back meetings, sleepless nights in luxury hotels, chasing contracts and partnerships across continents like they were pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite finish. He remembered burying himself in work to avoid feeling anything. Now, he saw where all that escaping had led him. "They look just like you," he murmured, eyes still fixed on the girls. "But their eyes, they're mine." Celia followed his gaze. Her expression softened, though a layer of caution still lingered behind it. "Yeah. They ask a lot of questions. They want to know why I'm always tired, why we don't have what other kids have. But they never complain. They've never once asked about their father." His heart ached at the thought. "Because you never told them?" "Because I didn't know how," she replied. "I didn't want to lie. But I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth either, not when I wasn't sure if you'd ever want to be part of their lives. I didn't want to open a door that would just close again." Henry lowered himself onto the bench beside her slowly, leaving space between them. The smell of spilled coffee and warm grass filled the air. For a long moment, they both watched the girls in silence. "I can't fix what I missed," he said. "But I want to try. I want to know them, Celia. I want to know you again." She looked at him, long and hard, and he could see the years in her eyes, the late nights, the loneliness, the strength it had taken to raise 3 daughters without help. But he also saw something else. A flicker. A light that hadn't gone out, even after everything. "I don't know what you're expecting," she said quietly. "This isn't a movie. You don't get to show up and be the hero." "I'm not here to be the hero," he said. "I'm here because I found something I didn't even know I'd lost. And now that I've found it, I can't walk away." She turned toward him, her expression unreadable, caught between caution and something dangerously close to hope. For the first time in years, they weren't adversaries or strangers. They were just two people standing at the edge of something new, still raw with uncertainty, but suddenly wide open with possibility. From the grass, one of the girls called out, waving in their direction. Celia smiled softly. Henry did too. And though nothing had been resolved, and nothing had yet been promised, both of them knew that something had shifted. Not everything broken had to stay that way. The next morning, Henry stood in front of his bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection like it belonged to someone else. His face was familiar, the sharp jawline, the faint creases around his eyes, the same carefully trimmed stubble. But something behind his eyes had shifted. He could feel it, like a string had been pulled loose inside him, and now everything was unraveling, not chaotically, but with purpose. He didn't put on his usual suit. Instead, he chose a soft navy sweater and jeans, clothes he hadn't worn in months. There was no board meeting on his calendar, no international call demanding his attention. Today, he was going back to the park. When he arrived, the girls weren't singing. They were sitting on a blanket under a tree, drawing with stubby colored pencils on folded pieces of paper. Celia sat nearby, her laptop closed, a book resting on her knee. She looked up when she saw him, and for a moment her expression was unreadable, still cautious, but no longer guarded. She gave him the smallest of nods, which he took as permission to approach. The girls noticed him too, and immediately stood, whispering to each other with the secretive energy that only 6-year-olds possess. The bold one, Katie, he'd learned, walked up to him with a squint of curiosity. "You're the man from yesterday," she declared, her voice matter-of-fact. Henry smiled. "I am. And you must be Katie." She tilted her head slightly. "How do you know my name?" "Your mom told me," he said. "I used to know her a long time ago." The other two girls approached, Lily and June. Their faces were identical, but their personalities already shone in small gestures. Lily clutched a paper drawing to her chest like it was a treasure, while June stood with her hands behind her back, studying him silently. He felt a lump rising in his throat and forced himself to stay calm. "Do you want to sit with us?" Katie asked. Henry blinked, surprised by the invitation. "I'd like that," he said quietly, and slowly lowered himself onto the blanket beside them. Celia said nothing, just watched from her spot, the book still unopened on her lap. She didn't interfere, didn't step in to explain who he was or why he was suddenly a presence in their morning routine. Henry understood this was a test, not of what he said, but of what he chose to do. He spent the next hour talking with the girls, answering their endless, curious questions. What did he do? Did he like chocolate or vanilla? Had he ever ridden a horse? Could he whistle? Did he know how to draw cats? At one point, Lily handed him a crayon and told him to make something amazing. His attempt at a butterfly was met with a chorus of giggles, which, strangely, didn't bother him at all. They showed him their drawings, crayon rainbows, smiling suns, a picture of Celia holding all three of their hands. There was no father drawn in, just an empty space beside the sun. He didn't ask about it, didn't comment. He knew it wasn't an accident. After a while, Celia stood and stretched, walking over with the kind of slow, cautious steps that spoke of mixed feelings. "They like you," she said quietly, arms crossed. "I like them," Henry replied. "A lot." She looked down at them, the way a mother does, with pride and exhaustion and a fierce love that never asks for recognition. "They've never had a man stick around," she admitted, not accusing, just honest. Even the ones who tried didn't last more than a few weeks. They didn't understand what it meant to show up for someone every day. Henry looked at her, understanding the weight behind her words. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I'm not asking for anything yet. I just want to be here. If you'll let me." Celia hesitated, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The kind of nod that means, "We'll see." It was more than he expected. The sun moved slowly across the sky, and for the first time in years, Henry didn't check his watch. He stayed on the blanket, letting the girls braid grass into his hair and tell him made-up stories about magical kingdoms and invisible pets. He didn't realize how much time had passed until Katie tugged on his sleeve and said, "You should come back tomorrow." Something in his chest lifted at the words. "I will," he promised. And for the first time in a long time, he meant it. Henry kept his promise. The next morning, he arrived at the park just as the sun crept over the tops of the trees, casting long golden streaks across the grass. He brought a small picnic basket filled with muffins, juice boxes, and paper napkins covered in cartoon dinosaurs. He wasn't sure what 6-year-old girls liked, but he'd stood in the grocery aisle for nearly 20 minutes trying to figure it out. When the girls spotted him, they ran up with shrieks of laughter, surrounding him in a tangle of arms and questions. To his surprise, Celia smiled from her usual bench. It was subtle, cautious, but genuine, and it made something inside him settle. Day after day, he came back. He showed up whether it was sunny or cloudy, whether he'd had a good night's sleep or barely rested. He started learning their routines, the rhythms of their world. Mornings in the park, afternoon crafts, stories under the tree. He learned that Lily loved bugs and could name more types of beetles than he thought existed, that June hated socks and always found a reason to take hers off, and that Katie believed she could speak to birds and had entire conversations with robins. They were all wildly different, yet so inseparable they finished each other's sentences and rarely argued, except over who got the last strawberry from the basket. Henry never tried to explain his role. He didn't show up with grand gestures or promises. He just came and listened and learned. He helped them build twig forts and tried, and failed, to learn their clapping games. He brought books and read aloud in silly voices until they collapsed in giggles. Sometimes, he just sat and watched them, quietly amazed that these 3 little girls had existed in the world without him for 6 entire years. Celia began to soften, slowly, like a thaw that couldn't be rushed. One afternoon, while the girls were drawing mermaids in the dirt with sticks, she handed Henry a folded piece of paper. "Their schedule," she said simply. "Just so you know when ballet is. And doctor appointments." He unfolded it like it was sacred. "Thank you," he said, careful not to say too much, to push too fast. Later that same week, she let him walk them home. Their apartment was small but tidy, filled with laughter and books and a worn couch covered in mismatched blankets. The hallway was lined with drawings, and their names were written in colorful crayon over their bedroom doors. There was a 4th door, slightly ajar, with a mattress on the floor and a pile of laundry waiting to be folded. He paused in front of it for a moment too long, and Celia noticed. "It's not perfect," she said, brushing past him. "But it's what we have." Henry didn't comment on the peeling paint or the cracked tile in the kitchen. Instead, he said, "You've built something beautiful here." She looked at him, tired eyes narrowing slightly. "I built it alone." "I know," he said. "And you've done more than I can understand. I just want to be a part of it now." She didn't respond, but she didn't push him away either. That night, he helped wash dishes while the girls sang behind him. He dried plates and wiped down the counter like he'd been doing it for years. And when he left, June slipped a sticker into his pocket, a glittery star with a smiley face. "Because you're learning," she whispered, as if it were a secret. That night, Henry sat in his empty apartment, gleaming, cold, and full of silence, and realized he didn't miss any of it. Not the skyline view, not the $100 wine, not the imported furniture. He missed the mess. He missed the noise. He missed them. The next morning, he packed away 3/4 of his wardrobe, sold a few paintings, and called his real estate agent. He didn't need a fortress anymore. He needed a door that stayed open. Summer rolled forward like a slow river, each day folding gently into the next. What began as casual visits turned into habit, and then something deeper, routine, belonging. Henry no longer needed a reason to be in the park each morning, the girls expected him, and he came. What changed, however, was not just the consistency of his presence, but the way space began to grow around it. It was as if, little by little, Celia was learning how to breathe again with him nearby. She didn't hover when he spoke with the girls, didn't intervene when he helped them work through a disagreement or read them another chapter of their favorite fairy tale. Instead, she began to trust him, not completely, not without limits, but enough to exhale. One afternoon in late July, the heat pressed down like a thick blanket, and the girls lay sprawled in the grass beneath a tree, fanning themselves with leaves and taking slow sips from their water bottles. Celia arrived late, clearly flustered, her hair twisted into a quick bun, her shoulders tense. Henry immediately noticed something was wrong. She dropped into the shade beside him, eyes glazed and tired. "Lost a client," she muttered, pulling off her shoes. "They said they loved my writing, but their cousin needed the job. Family discount. You know how it is." He didn't, not really, but he nodded anyway. She wasn't looking for advice, she just needed someone to listen. "Do you ever feel like you're climbing a ladder that's actually a treadmill?" she asked, tilting her head toward the sky. "Working non-stop and somehow getting nowhere." Henry glanced at her. "I spent years climbing one. Mine just led to a windowless boardroom and a hollow chest." Her lips curled slightly at that. Not quite a smile, but not far from it either. They sat like that in the quiet for a long time, the occasional burst of laughter from the girls reminding them why they were both still trying. Later that week, Henry asked Celia if he could take the girls for the afternoon, alone. She hesitated, eyebrows raised, clearly unsure, but after a moment, she said yes. Her voice was tight with trust stretched thin, but she said yes. He took them to a nearby bookstore with a tiny cafe in the back, where the shelves reached to the ceiling and the smell of old paper mixed with cinnamon rolls. The girls ran wild between aisles, selecting stories with dragons and secret gardens and space unicorns. They read on beanbags and spilled crumbs and argued over who got to sit closest to Henry, who ended up squished in the middle, holding a copy of The Velveteen Rabbit, with 3 blonde heads leaning on his shoulders. At the register, when he paid for the books, Katie looked up at him and said, very seriously, "You'd make a good dad." He couldn't speak for a moment. He knelt down instead and tied her shoelaces, not trusting his voice. A few days later, Henry showed Celia something he hadn't shown anyone in a very long time, his vulnerability. He asked her to coffee, just the two of them. She agreed, cautiously. They met at a quiet corner cafe, where she nursed a lukewarm cappuccino and he stirred his drink for far too long before finally speaking. "I sold the condo," he said simply. Celia raised an eyebrow. "You love that place." "I thought I did," he replied. "But I realized it was just a very expensive place to be alone." She didn't say anything right away, just watched him. So he continued. "I bought a house. Nothing big, but it has a yard. And 3 bedrooms. Her fingers tightened around the cup. "You think you can just buy your way back into our lives?" "No," he said, gently. "I think I can earn my way in, if you let me." Her eyes softened slightly. "Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something warmer than before." She didn't smile, but she didn't walk away either. That was enough. By the time August arrived, the girls had begun drawing pictures that included him. Stick figures of Celia and the girls and one man with messy brown hair and a big smile. They called him H in their secret codes, scribbled in chalk on the sidewalk. One afternoon, June asked if he had a bedtime song he liked when he was little. When he said yes, she made him sing it. He was terrible. They loved it. Henry was no longer just a visitor. He was part of their rhythm. Their days. Their laughter. Their mess. And one evening, when he tucked them in after Celia's freelance shift ran late, Lily whispered from her pillow, "It's nice you're here now." He didn't cry. Not until the lights were out and he was alone again. But that night, the tears were not for regret. They were for everything he was finally becoming. The last weeks of summer came with a golden softness, the kind of warmth that made everything feel slower, sweeter, suspended in time. The park, once a place of discovery, had become a familiar backdrop, no longer just a setting for chance meetings, but a kind of second home. By now, Henry knew the girls' routines better than his own. He knew how Lily liked to hum to herself when she was coloring, how June always needed to be the one to push the swing, and how Katie, always first to speak, often stayed quiet when something really mattered. He had learned how to braid hair, sort of, how to clean up glitter without losing his mind, and how to carry 3 girls at once when they pretended the grass was lava. Celia watched it all unfold with quiet reflection. She had never imagined this, never dared to, but now it was real. Henry had not only stayed, he had grown into the spaces of their lives with a kind of patience and humility that no version of him from the past had ever possessed. She didn't let her guard fall all at once. Trust wasn't a door she swung open, but a window she cracked gradually, letting light in inch by inch. And yet, it had happened. The fear that he would vanish had begun to fade, replaced by the growing truth that he wasn't going anywhere. One Saturday afternoon, they planned a small picnic in the park, their last before school began. Celia packed sandwiches, Henry brought a kite, and the girls insisted on wearing matching flower crowns they had made from clover. The sky stretched wide and cloudless above them as they sprawled on a blanket beneath their favorite tree, the same one where Henry had first watched them sing. It felt like years ago. It felt like yesterday. After lunch, Henry took the girls to fly the kite while Celia stayed behind, lying back on the blanket with her eyes closed, listening to the laughter echoing across the field. She barely heard the footsteps when he returned alone, sitting down beside her without a word. She opened her eyes and turned to look at him. He looked calm, but there was something in the way he kept fidgeting with the grass. "They asked me a question this morning," he said after a moment. All 3 of them, in perfect unison. Celia tilted her head. "What did they ask?" "They asked if they could call me Dad." She didn't answer right away. She sat up slowly, brushing grass off her skirt, her eyes scanning the field until she spotted the girls, now trying to untangle the kite from a bush. "And what did you say?" she asked. "I told them they could," he said. "But only if you're okay with it." Her breath caught slightly. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, her hand reached for his, not dramatically, not like a scene from a movie, but simply and honestly. She laced her fingers through his. "I'm okay with it," she said softly. "I think they've known who you are for a while. And maybe, so have I." They sat in silence for a while, watching their daughters wrestle with the kite, falling over each other in laughter. It was messy, and loud, and perfect. Later that evening, back at Celia's apartment, the girls performed a song they had been practicing in secret. They stood in front of the living room window, holding hands, singing a sweet, wobbly rendition of a tune Henry didn't recognize. When they finished, they bowed dramatically and pointed to the coffee table. Sitting there was a hand-drawn card, covered in stickers and sparkles. In the center, written in the careful, oversized letters of 6-year-olds, were the words, "Welcome home, Dad." He didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply knelt down, pulled all 3 girls into his arms, and held them like the world had just stopped spinning and finally landed exactly where it should be. Behind them, Celia watched, her arms crossed and her eyes glassy. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't carrying everything alone. There was still life ahead, school mornings, dentist appointments, scrapes and tantrums, hard days and harder nights. But there would also be birthdays, bedtime stories, Saturday pancakes, and kites that sometimes flew and sometimes crashed. And in all of it, they would be together. Not perfect. Not easy. But whole.